This is F. Scott Fitzgerald, and this is the story of how subsidiary rights, particularly serial rights, can affect one's writing career. In 1836, Honoré de Balzac had The Old Maid published in a French newspaper and produced what many consider to be the first single-authored serialized content, a serialized novel. This would kick off the next wave in publishing, as Charles Dickens, Henry James, and other social commentators would sell their protracted stories to magazines that were being founded at the time and wanted to ride the crest of the wave. These magazines included The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's Magazine, and All Year Round. Some of them went on to become publishing giants or major publications to this day. The Atlantic Monthly today goes by The Atlantic, and Harper's is now the world's second oldest monthly magazine. Its founders also went on to found what is today known as HarperCollins. In a time where serialized novels were all the rage, Scribner and Sons went the other way. This is surprising, as an article in their very own magazine, Scribner's Monthly, described how popular serialized content was in the 19th century by referring to it as the domain of the best novelists. Such was the popularity that Harper's even pirated serial installments of Dickens and the Bronte sisters. But what exactly were they turning away from? Serial rights refer to when third-party producers serial rights refer to when a third party produces a derivative of the original work in a different format. This was usually newspapers, magazines, and other periodicals. There are two types. First, serial relates to the derivatives being published before the sale of the book form, and the second serial relates to the derivatives after the book form has been published. In his final semester at Princeton University, Fitzgerald wrote a manuscript and sent it to Scribner and Sons. They were the publishing house that was instrumental in founding the Princeton University Press. His manuscript was rejected. Scribner's editor at the time, Maxwell Perkins, feared that he may not return. At that time, Fitzgerald had already written his first short story for the Saturday Evening Post and earned $400. However, Scribner was the publishing house he always wanted to write for. His mentor at Princeton had previously been published by Scribner, as well as Shane Leslie and Henry Adams, authors that he had met as a teenager and idolized. And in 1920, The Romantic Egotist was published as This Side of Paradise. It is somewhat ironic that he had named it that, for it was naive of him to enter into an agreement with Scribner with no agent. Charles Scribner detested agents and therefore engaged in fiduciary agreements of trust. As James West described, something akin to a doctor and patient or a lawyer and client. This would come back to haunt Fitzgerald. That's because Scribner based their business philosophy on that of the oldest British publishing houses, such as Murray, Constable, and Longman. Their book business was based on cooperation and price control. This meant that Scribner annually published a short list and spent hardly anything on advertising. They would focus on encyclopedias and dictionaries. Northeast America was their region, as they limited themselves to a specific geographical region and demographic. Multi-book deals were not offered, and Fitzgerald would come to learn that they did not care much for subsidiary rights. Scribner would argue that it was undignified to market such rights. What were Fitzgerald's options at the time? West highlighted three that he believed would have made a great fit with Fitzgerald. S.S. McClure had a large amount of venture capital and extensive magazine tie-ins, including his own McClure magazine. They were all about large-scale distribution. Bonney and Liveright were bold and brash and eventually went bankrupt, but heavily invested in marketing their novels and reaping rewards from their intellectual property. They handled bestsellers such as Warner Fabian's Flaming Youth, which sold 100,000 copies. Doubleday and Company had access to both the British and American markets, which meant they had great experience in licensing works. One only has to look at the management of Edith Wharton and Fitzgerald in 1920. Wharton had previously been published by Scribner, but left when she realized that they were not fully capitalizing on her work's financial potential. As stated earlier, Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise was published by Scribner in 1920. Its first print run of 3,000 copies sold out quickly. It was an unexpected hit. However, Scribner failed to capitalize on the book's subsidiary rights. The novel was never serialized or accepted before publication, and its reprint edition was simply binding of some leftover sheets by a remainder house. Seeing as the book was so difficult to get a hold of, one would think that Scribner would take advantage of the second serial rights, but they only managed to bring in a few $100. That same year, Appleton and Company published Wharton's Age of Innocence, initially as a 4-part serial in a Pictorial Review magazine. The book went on to sell 66,000 copies that year, compared to that of This Side of Paradise's 49,000. Better yet, Wharton won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction the following year, and Appleton sold her movie rights for $15,000. It was only years later that Scribner even attempted to get the movie rights sold, and even then it is not known if the rumored $10,000 was even paid. Scribner was a conservative publishing house, and were in the business of not losing money. Like I mentioned earlier, publications such as Harper were able to pirate serialized content of other publishers. Scribner wanted to print and sell books and considered serials to be giving away content for free. As a result, mass circulation magazines. Fitzgerald wrote 160 short stories for various magazines, which brought in $241,453 in revenue. To put it into perspective, Fitzgerald only received $12,400 in royalties for the short story collections that he had published with Scribner. At his peak, Fitzgerald was commanding $4,000 per short story. Imagine if Scribner had the vision to capitalize on serials. The Count of Monte Cristo had 139 installments before being published as a novel. Some authors wrote their serials over a 2-year period. Serials were so popular that they influenced the industry standard of novels. When Fitzgerald published his third novel, The Great Gatsby, in 1925, it sold less than 24,000 copies. It is often described as a short novel, and it was for its time, as it was only 184 pages compared to the 305 of Age of Innocence. The writing of short stories took a toll on him creatively. It took Fitzgerald 9 years to complete what would be his final complete novel. It was only then, with Fitzgerald's fourth novel, that Scribner eventually turned to serials. 10 Days a Night was published in 1934 in the first 4 issues of Scribner magazine that year. However, it only sold 15,000 copies. It also happened to coincide with the Great Depression. Scribner had missed the trick, and Fitzgerald paid the price for it. The money he earned selling short stories to magazines would constitute 64% of his life earnings. Did Scribner do right by him? No. They just wanted to ensure that they covered their expenses and were too proud to let any third party have access to their work. Maybe if Fitzgerald had an agent at the time, he would have been able to get a better deal for himself, but he considered Scribner to be working on his behalf. This just highlights how publishers exploited authors, and also how the interests of the author and the publishing house are not the same. By Fitzgerald not taking advantage of his serial rights, he had to work harder than he needed to, which left him physically and emotionally drained. He was also a struggling alcoholic. Imagine if he had the time, energy, and support to focus on one storyline at a time.